皆さん、また来てくださってありがとうございます。こちらはマンハッタンニューヨーク水曜日の午後です。ということでね、先週の、日曜日かな土曜日かな南イスラエルの音楽祭で、多くの人がテロにあって亡くなってすごく悲惨な事件が起こったっていうことでバーッとカオスが起きたんですけど、これが日曜日に表に出てきたことで、あと月曜日にはとうとう民主党じゃなくって独立党から、Rfk ジュニアさんが出馬するっていう宣言をされて、なんかね CPAC っていうね保守党のディベートにもなんか共和党が彼を招待しちゃって、それに関して結構みんながなんでだよみたいな感じで怒っているということがあるんですね。なぜかっていうとね、共和党の中の支持者の方すごく多いんですね。RFK ジュニアさんの。で、私が見に行った時も、あれ、ハニティショーだから、フォックスのゲストとして招待されて、今回もよくフォックスに出ていらっしゃるんですよ。で、決してこの人は共和党じゃないんですね。でも、やっぱり民主党からはもうどうやっても出させてもらえないような感じなので独立党から出るっていう宣言をされて、ニューハンプシャーだったかなで宣言をされたんですけども、すごい人で、やっぱりちょっと人気があるとこれぐらいの人が集まるんだなっていうことは見てもらえたと思うし、これでだいたいどれくらい票が入るっていうのもわかるんじゃないかなと思います。ということでね、こういうのを見るとやっぱりバイデン大統領がトランプ氏を破って8000万票以上取ったという、その現役の大統領の遊説先には80人も集まらないっていう、これがやっぱり不正だったのかなっていうことを証明している絵だなと私は思っているんですね。ということでね、今日の動画は1本だけタッカーカールソンさんにヴィヴェクさんが出ているものなんですね。で、私はもうディベートはもう見ないでもいいかなって思ってるんですよ。それっていうのはね、トランプさんが出ないのは1個あるんですけど、このフォックスがね、どうもね、なんかヴィベクさんとかもうちょっと話が聞きたいなと思う人をバッとカットオフするんですよね。だから結局聞きたいことが聞けないで、ああだこうだっていう小学生並みのあいつが悪いこいつが悪いっていうのがもう本当に非常に幼稚で、見るに耐えないので、そういうところをタッカー・カールソンさんが拾ってもうちょっと深掘りしてみようかっていうことで、今回ヴィヴェクさんを招いてらっしゃるので見てください。どうぞ。
No decent person can watch the video of young people being murdered at a music festival in southern Israel without feeling horrified. It's awful, and there's no excusing it. No matter what you think of Israel's policies in Gaza, you are not allowed to shoot people at music festivals. That's a crime. Israel has a right to respond to that crime and to defend itself. No one seriously contests that. The question for American policymakers, however, is what do we do next? How do we represent the interests of the United States in this chaotic moment? That's not a selfish question. It's the whole point of making policy for a country, to improve and protect that country. If you serve in the U.S. Congress or in the executive branch of government, you have a moral duty to think this way. It's your job. You serve the United States and its population. You have no moral authority except to the extent that you represent your fellow Americans. That's our system. You escalate into a war between Iran and its allies and the West. Once a war like that starts, you could easily imagine the use of nuclear weapons and all that entails. Millions dead, the collapse of the global economy. At the very least, you could see an unprecedented energy crisis here. Already gas in one Bay Area service station hit $7.29 a gallon over the weekend. If that trend worsens and persists, the United States, which is already, technically speaking, bankrupt, would plunge into depression. Wisdom and long-term thinking are essential, but you will not be surprised to learn that is not what we are getting. Watch this person, for example, who happens to be the media's pick for President of the United States.
This is not just an attack on Israel. This is an attack on America because they hate us just as much. And what we have to understand is This is the reason that we have to unite around making sure our enemies do not hurt our friends. America can never be so arrogant to think we don't need friends, just like we needed them on 9/11. That's why Ukraine needs us when Russia's doing this. That's why Israel needs us when Hamas and Iran are doing this. And I'll say this to Prime Minister Netanyahu, finish them. Finish them. Hamas did this. You know Iran's behind it. Finish them. They should have hell to pay for what they've just done.
This was an attack on America, she says, when in fact it was not. And for that reason, we must, quote, finish Iran, a nation of nearly 90 million people. What are we watching here? This is not sober leadership. She's a child, and this is the tantrum of a child. Ignorant, cocksure, bloodthirsty. Here's fellow neocon Lindsey Graham just spelling it out and calling for the bombing of Iran.
So I've been on the phone all day to the Mideast, and I've told our allies and people with connections to Iran what I would do. I would tell Iran that if Hezbollah attacks Israel, we're going to come after you, the Iranians, and have a coordinated effort between the United States and Israel to put Iran out of the oil business by destroying their refineries. There are 4 major refineries in Iran. They're fixed targets. If Hezbollah attacks Israel, I would make Iran pay a heavy price.
What exactly would happen to the United States if we declared war on Iran and started blowing up their infrastructure? Lindsey Graham has no clue what would happen. He hasn't thought it through. He's almost 70 years old and he has no children. He doesn't care. But neither, amazingly, do most of his colleagues in Washington. They're as reckless as he is. A war to end all wars, as if there is such a thing. But of course, there isn't such a thing. Wars beget more war. The bigger the conflict, the uglier and longer lasting the consequences. Vivek Ramaswamy dared to suggest that actually going to war with Iran might not be in America's national interest. And for saying that, Mike Pence immediately denounced him as gutless and unpatriotic or something. But we thought it might be worth hearing more. Vivek Ramaswamy joins us now. Vivek, thanks so much for coming on. So if I'm reading this correctly, you suggested, while offering what seemed like real sympathy to the Israeli people, to the many murdered there 2 days ago, you noted that maybe it's not in America's best long-term interest to declare war on Iran. Is that what you said?
I actually said this long before this crisis when people were thinking clear-headedly. And I just want to say a couple of things that are obvious but important, Tucker. I mean, what happened against Israel, you said it, I believe it. It is barbaric. It is medieval, It is wrong, and Israel as a nation absolutely has the right to self-defense, to its own national existence. And I think they should have our moral and diplomatic support as an ally. But there's one element of this that nobody's talking about. What the hell went wrong with U.S. and Israeli intelligence and the Israeli defense that allowed this to happen? Everybody seems to be punting that as a question for later. I think it's a question for now, if you're Israel. I mean, look, I think that Nikki Haley, I disagree with you a little bit there. I don't think she's a child. I think that she is somebody who is, like many politicians, in a position to get wealthier from war. Look at the military contracting business and otherwise. But put that to one side. The message that I would send would be very different. Get to the bottom of what allowed this gaping hole of intelligence and defense to even happen before feeding that same beast. If a doctor told you his job was to keep you from getting cancer and then you got that cancer, don't go trust that same doctor to remove your tumor. They don't let airplanes, when they crash, the pilots or the people who crash the airplane, that airliner is not the one who reviews the black box. And so I think those answers have to come now. That's not a question for later. And I think one of the learnings for the U.S., I think there's a lot of learnings for the U.S., Tucker, but one of the learnings is if that establishment can get it wrong in Israel from a U.S. perspective, that can happen right here at home. And if anything, as an ally, one of the things that we need to wake up to is that we're vulnerable here in the United States to the same. And so we can do some things to prevent that, secure our border, stop funding. I mean, I think one of the things that's been wrong in the U.S. is we have a bad habit while we're bankrupt funding both sides of wars that should have been avoided in the first place. Look at the money that's indirectly found its way to Hamas, the $6 billion paid to Iran in the recent ransom. That was a disaster. Yet we're effectively now funding both sides of a war that we shouldn't have been in the first place in places like Russia and Ukraine even. Think about how we hampered oil production in the United States and then now has funding, U.S. funding going to Ukraine in fighting back against Russia. It's a bad habit in the United States, and we need leaders here who will look after what advances American interests. And I find what Dan Crenshaw said to be cringeworthy. It is shameful. World War I was supposed to be the war that ended all wars, that got us to World War II. That can't be the way that we run foreign policy. The job of American leaders is to advance American interests, and I think we support Israeli leaders asking what advances and defends Israel as we should, morally and diplomatically, but leaders here need to look after American interests first.
ということで、今こういう意見が、冷静な意見が出てるのは多分他の番組ではなかったんじゃないかなと思ったので、今日挙げてみました。で、やっぱり本当に一番悪いのはもちろんテロリストなんですけれども、やっぱりもっと悪質なのはこのバイデン政権でこういうことを挑発しては起こしっていうことをずっとしてるって思うと、本当にその被害になっている子どもたちやお年寄りや弱い人たち、市民、武器を持たない市民がその犠牲になってると思うと、本当にトランプさんがもしあと4年やってくれたらこんなの全然なかったんだろうになって思うと、本当に次こそはトランプさんに一刻も早くこの世界情勢を回避するために大統領になってほしいなと思います。もともとRfkジュニアさんが出てきた時に、私もRfkジュニアさんいいなと思ってたんですけど、やっぱりこういう世界情勢とか外交とかになると、ここまで世界がめちゃめちゃになっちゃうと、アメリカの人はやっぱりトランプさんの方に票が行くんじゃないかなというふうに思っています。ということで、また見てください。